Good evening and welcome to our first video on this channel, the 1838 cookbook. I'm sorry, but that was the best name I could come up with the channel, because the book in question, this here, was originally written in 1838 by Ferdinand Hauptner. And this is the second edition, as it was published on May 9th, 1841, after he ran out of the first print of this, out of the first edition. They reprinted it, and he says in the foreword, he writes in here that basically in this edition, all they did was to correct some spelling and grammar errors, basically. Otherwise, the content of the book is exactly identical as to the first edition. And this book basically is probably the oldest version which is still in circulation, or is available. At least I got it. I was not able to find the first version of this. Back then they did not state on how many they printed, in each revision or edition they did. So we don't know. Maybe they printed 1,000 for the first edition and maybe another 1,000 in the second edition. I couldn't tell you. But you can see this book is pretty thick, and it is written in Fraktur, which I can read. Maybe you can read it too. Now, the purpose of this book is this, or this first video, and I encourage everyone to watch this before we get into actually cooking some of these recipes here on this, we're presenting them on this channel here. The way he structured this cookbook, Ferdinand Hauptner structured this, is very, very different than the cookbooks we have today, or maybe had since the 1920s, probably the last 100 years. The cooking has not really changed in terms of the dishes. You will see this when we get there. But what has changed is the quantities for servings, because back then the families, of course, were bigger. You had probably 2 adults at a minimum, and then 4, 6, 8, 10 children, 12 children in those years, and more often than not, probably other adult members in the family. And if this was a well-to-do family, they probably had servants and other people, employees, working for them, which also had to be fed. So the daily cooking chore was probably more like in the range of 10 to 20 people for many households. And as our societies and the Industrial Revolution progressed, the families and the cooking itself in terms of quantity got smaller. Now the typical family today is probably 2 to 4 people. There's many single, households we have, and the larger family affairs is usually limited now, to the holidays. Thinking about Labor Day, we had ours today here. You have Thanksgiving, of course, here in America is a big thing, and then Christmas, birthdays, New Year's Eve parties, and that sort of stuff, where we have all special functions, religious, events, like communions, holy communions, and that sort of stuff, where you have more family coming together and celebrating this, and then requires bigger cooking. So this is the first thing. So what he did is, he first explained the nomenclature in here, basically terms he used throughout this book. Because of his French background, his parents came from France. They were Huguenots, and I think he was the first generation, born actually in Berlin, and so he was bilingual, fluent in French and German. and he went on to become a very successful and very good chef. I have to say this. You will see this when we go through this. And he was very, very meticulous. The knowledge just reflected in this book is unbelievable. And so what he does is he talks about portions. And he also addresses this right in the beginning in the second or third chapter. He talks about the kitchen equipment, what he would suggest to use, or what every household, how should I say, not a housewife, well, back then it was mostly housewives, but whoever was in charge of the kitchen should have, the chef, so to speak, without making really any distinction, male or female or anything in between. It's really not that important. The person in charge of the kitchen, basically, and of the menu. That chapter was for them. And then he discusses the changes since he wrote this in 1838. Until that time, the standard was that the food would be served from the kitchen in serving bowls or serving dishes, the big bowls usually, either with a lid or without a lid. And they're usually being passed around, when you sit on it, when you don't have any servers or waiters. Otherwise, you would have the server and the waiter. You would have a side buffet, usually with plates, hot plates on them. They're usually the ones which use the alcohol-type burners underneath to keep these dishes warm, and you would bring them out, usually starting with the soup, and then you had a hors d'oeuvre or fish or other main course. And all of this is described in here. And what he basically says is his quantities, when he specifies them in these recipes, for one is he uses the Prussian standard measurements of the 1830s. And in the back of the book, he has a conversion chart for people somewhere else in Germany primarily. This is the index. Let me just see if I can get to that fairly easy, where he shows this. He says that it's actually not just the Prussian standard, but it was the Berlin standard for weight and volume, basically. And then he basically shows this here on these pages for people in other areas in Germany, because Germany was not unified. So there was nothing unified. So he has the Berlin quart, which is almost equal to the American quart today, which is about 1 liter. And they have it in Munich, in Mainz, in Lithuania, then the Hanover, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Brunswick, Breslau, Cologne, and then the Danish, Dresden, Vienna, and Württemberg, all these different areas he converts this over, because everyone had a different unit of measurement. So this is how divided Germany was. There was nothing unified at that point, not even the units of measurement for measuring weight or volume. And he has calculated, he wrote in here, that his serving bowl, say like if he makes a bowl, or what he says a size of serving, would be for 10 people, say like for the potatoes, and that would equal then one serving bowl, one serving dish. So if you had 100 people, you would make 10 bowls in that size. If you had 5 people, you would make a half a bowl. And if you had only 2 people, basically, you would make only a quarter of that size for 2 people, basically. Then he also states in here, if prestige is important to you, that means you're representing something, if you want to look wealthy or you want it to be seen wealthy, you would basically serve, instead of, if you had 10 guests, you would cook for 12 to 15 people. So you would make 1.5 bowls, actually, even though you served only, which gave you leftovers. In this book also, and this is why that took me quite a while to work my way through, he has an entire section in there on how to basically utilized the leftovers, and what they did is they put them in tin cans, which were then sorted, and so you could put a complete meal together. And if someone were to go to travel, they could take it with them. And these tin cans then were then just basically heated up in warm water at about 180 degrees Fahrenheit, 75 degrees Celsius, somewhere around there. You didn't want to boil this, and then you open that with these can openers, tuck, 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 you go around it, and you had a complete meal. Then for travel purposes or at night, one of the stories about my third great grandfather was that he got hungry. He woke up around midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, every other night, and he would then, with his candlelight stick, go. I don't think he didn't like the oil lamps. He had a candlelight, and he would go through the staircase down into the basement and then run over in the basement to the kitchen, because that's where all that stuff was stored. That canned food, tin cans, would last years, literally. So they wrote on there with chalk usually, or with what was in there, and he would just, because they kept the fire going in the stove overnight, he could then just heat up some water and then heat himself up one of these smaller cans, open it up and eat it without waking anyone else up. That's basically what they did, is because they slept at night. They didn't care who he was, literally. He had to go down there and get his own late night snack if it was during the kitchen hours were closed. I wrote it in here. I copied that over from Wikipedia, the introduction here for the channel, because most of the stuff is correct. And you can see this is Hauptner had his classes from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. So a lot of times they cooked then for their dinner at the castle, but many times there was no one there. And that had to do with that my third great grandfather was the honorary he was the honorary general or leader of the 1st Lithuanian Dragoon Regiment in Lithuania, not in Lithuania, in Tilsit, which was just a few miles back then from the Lithuanian border. Now the border is directly at Tilsit, at the city of Tilsit, because the mainland was yielded to Lithuania after World War I already. That was already gone by World War I. Anyway, so he was up there at least every 3 months for 6 weeks, and he lived there. And many times he took these cans with him because he wanted to eat something besides the food he got in the Prussian military. The Prussian military, this is just as a side note, treated everyone equal. That meant it didn't matter if you were a general or if you were just a regular, soldier, foot soldier. Everyone got the same food and everyone got the same amount of food. There was no extras. The only time you got a second was when you accomplished more than what was requested, or you did very well that day. You were entitled to a second serving. And that was the same whether you were a general or if you were on the bottom of the pit, basically, as an enlisted man just starting out. That is just as a side note. So that's why he took those cans with him. And that became then so popular that Hauptner actually wrote another manual for the Prussian military on how to prepare the canned foods. And today we know this kind of food as MRE, meals ready to eat, basically. Except that you don't necessarily need, a pot with water, but you still need a heat source to heat it, but you can heat them up directly. Back then they used water to heat them. So that is a big part of this book too, and how this is disposed. But now back to this, which makes this book so different, is he divided this into chapters, but the chapters are actually what we would consider courses. And he winds up with 16 courses. Now you're going to sit back and you read this. So he starts out the first course soup, second course fish, third course is roasted meats, basically. Then we have the fourth one is then, let me just see what that was. I gotta go back here to it. It is very, very different as the cookbooks today. Dritter Gang, zweiter Gang, vierter Gang. Vierter Gang, die großen Fleischstücke. Yeah, third was fish. Then, second is hors d'oeuvres. First soups, hors d'oeuvres. Second, third fish. Fourth is the big meat portions. That means that was usually done rotisserie style, or they did it on a boiled, that sort of thing. And then they had the fifth course was then fünfter Gang. The fifth course would have been vegetables, including potatoes. And he has listed here just the varieties of the potatoes, like potatoes à la Strasbourg. Then they have en gratin, les Espagnols mit Hammelsquarret glacé. Hammel is mutton. There's a lot of mutton meat in here. As an alternative, that's what they were eating. But there's at least 25, 30 different versions of potatoes in here. And then he has the sixth course would be warme entries, hot entries from either, poultry, wild poultry, or regular domesticated poultry. Then beef or meat from game, and also then fish, again from the ocean, and fresh and seawater fish, and cold entrees as well. And that goes on and on and on. So, and then he got here at least 200 different entrees in all sorts of varieties, different fishes. Let me just give you an example on the fish variety they had in these, and then I will explain this to you and how this actually worked. So we had, for instance, he has a recipe for Atlantic cod, for sole, for shellfish. So that could be your shrimp, that could be crab meat, that could be lobsters, this could be oysters, that sort of stuff. Then we had Baltic cod. He has a dish or dishes in there. Trout, of course, salmon, smoked salmon, Atlantic salmon. Then we have carp, and then we have the Prussian carp, which came from East Prussia and Lithuania. They have a special version of the carp up there, which we refer to as Karauschen. That is the Prussian name for it, or the German name, and that is basically Prussian carp. We have mackerels, we have herrings, we have scallops, we have lobsters, crayfish. That was a big thing, especially over, in that area around Berlin. There's a lot of water, a lot of lakes, and a lot of rivers. So you had plenty of crayfish in there. Sardines, flounders, European plaice. That is the flatfish, the other one. And then we have, of course, northern pike and zander. Those fishes, for instance, that was in there. This is just an idea. And this is 1838, where they didn't have any refrigerated trucks. And they were getting this stuff in from the North Sea, from the Atlantic coast there, from France, from Italy, from the Mediterranean Sea, and of course from the Baltic. And they were carrying this on ice, which they had in these ice cellars, and they were able to transport this by horse and buggy, basically, because the railroad just started at that time when this book was written, in 1838. So the first railroad just barely started to operate at around 1840. By 1850 and 1860, there was a lot of railroad that were then established where this stuff moved a lot faster. So that even increased. But at that point, when this book here was written, this was all moved by horse and buggy. And on ice, partially frozen. One of the most interesting dishes he got listed in here is the American turtle ragu. Apparently, someone, probably in Holland or in Hamburg, Bremerhaven, imported turtles from the then American territories over there, because that was not fully developed yet in 1838 either. We didn't have all of the states. And some states were not part of the United States yet, and they probably came out of the Bahamas there in that region, in the Gulf of America, is it now, Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbeans and those areas, and probably the Florida Keys, Cuba. So they had these massive sea turtles brought in, which they called American turtles, because they came from the Americas without any big distinction exact where from. But he said they weighed about 70 to 80 pounds. Now, he's using the Berlin pound, which is very, very close to the American pound is what we're using for measurement, which is a little bit less than 500 grams than a half a kilogram. 400, I think, 80 grams or something like this to an American pound. So you can say it's a half a kilogram for simplicity reason, because that 20 grams is not going to make any difference. And he said these, that's what he wrote in here. He said these turtles, if they get to Europe alive, are extremely expensive. This is what he wrote in here. So even for his standards, buying this food, that he considered extremely expensive. And he also gave a way of how to actually kill the turtle. And of course, you can imagine at those prices, that was a very rare commodity. There were probably only a few ever sent over every year. He said you would have to wait until the turtle actually puts their head out, and then you have to use a very sharp knife and sever the head off, and then you would have to put the turtle into cold water so she completely bleeds out into it, and then he tells you how to dissect basically the entire shell and how to make a ragu out of this thing. From the way he wrote it, he probably did that only once in his entire career, at probably some particular function. But today, of course, you can't do this anymore, but there's these things in there. There's another part also in there where he talks about the poultries, where they're actually, captured singing birds, besides pigeons and domesticated birds, who were poultry, what we normally use, like pheasant and pearl hens and that sort of stuff. So they were actually, using regular singing birds back then with nets. They were caught during the summer months when they started to migrate south and that sort of stuff. So that is in here too. So a lot of these things, these recipes, we don't cook, of course, anymore because of our changed, view on protection of animals, protection of the environment, and that sort of stuff. So these type of recipes I will leave out because they're irrelevant today, but we will focus on those which are important. Then we have an entire chapter, for instance, on ice creams, desserts. He's explaining at least 20 different forms of recipes for ice creams in here, which we can make. Then we have the science, or the science of preserving fruits in rum, for instance. We call that the rum pot. So you build up that with rum, and you can use this with the ice cream over a year. You put them together. So there's some interesting recipes in there which you're gonna like. I'm certain they will sweeten stuff up. That is roughly what it is. So we have fish, we have a lot of meat stuff, of course, is in there. And then besides the regular poultry stuff and pork actually to a lesser degree, then a little bit of veal, and then there is a lot of beef. But secondary then is mutton, which is basically a 2 to 3 year old sheep, and there shouldn't be much older than that. So it's older than a lamb, and it is has a little bit more of a taste to it. I don't think I ever had mutton unless it was in some doner kebab, thing, which you would get at the Middle Eastern places, that sort of stuff. I have probably eaten over my lifetime about 30% of the recipes are in here. Some of the stuff is well known, This is something, filet mignon, basically, with the sauce hollandaise, sauce béarnaise, that kind of stuff is in here. Now, the other thing is, and this is why I waited so long with this video or with this book, was I had to research certain ingredients because I wasn't quite sure what that is. And of course, this book is nearly 300 years old. No, 1838, we're kind of a little bit less than 200 years old. And things change. But one thing which we still can get today, and which he recommended, is the French tarragon vinegar, which is white wine-based vinegar with tarragon in it. That was the primary vinegar he used, for instance, for salad dressing. And the oil he used is Provençal oil, what he called Provençal oil, which in essence is the Germanized word for Herbe de Provence oil, which you still can get from France. So this is the main ingredients. And then he had Bordeaux vinegar, which is your regular red wine vinegar from the Bordeaux region. If this was not available, for instance, I want to give you that example. Why I'm bringing this up is he makes a cucumber salad. And it is the typical standard cucumber salad as we make it today, where we peel the cucumber, we slice the cucumber, we salt the cucumber, we let it sit for 15 minutes, and we drain it. He actually drained it through a towel. You probably could use a cheesecloth. And then he made a standard vinaigrette-based salad dressing, basically, which could be added with buttermilk or with sour cream, either one of the two. And you could substitute, if you didn't have the tarragon dressing, for instance, you could just use buttermilk for it because it is sour enough and it will give you that soury taste. Lemons were not apparently as available at that time, so the use of lemon or olives is very limited, and he doesn't virtually use any olive oil. That is important to know. So these were the first things. So the next video I'm going to make, that was important that I had to research this. I will have some samples of Bordeaux vinegar and the tarragon vinegar here, and the Herbe de Provence oil. I will show you which ones are the ones to get without breaking the bank, and you don't have to be a multi-millionaire either to actually do this, and you will get then closer to the results he had. Buttermilk we can get very easily here. It is probably not going to taste exactly the same thing as the buttermilk did back then, and that was the reason for. There's actually two things I want to bring up here. Let me finish the vinegar before we're going to get into the milk-related stuff like buttermilk. What the difference is between today and what they had back then. In 1838, when this book was written, they didn't have distilled vinegar. The pure distilled vinegar is the clear vinegar you can buy at the store, which is usually comes in in these bottles, and everyone makes them. That is distilled vinegar. Most people use this for cleaning purposes. It's not very expensive. But the distilled vinegar is very different than the wine vinegar. And the wine vinegar, then again, has no distilled vinegar in it. There is, however, certain brands which sell wine vinegar, or they label it as wine vinegar, but they have 10% distilled vinegar in it, basically as a cut, which makes it cheaper to produce, and they get a more consistent taste out of it. Heinz, for instance, the Heinz vinegars, I checked it out at the supermarket, they all have distilled vinegar in it. Hengstenberg, the big German vinegar maker, they had that herbal vinegar, which I also have, that had, since they were making this since about the 1890s, so before that book was written. But that is another one of the vinegars he actually mentions in here, herbal vinegar, which would be the German vinegar, which later originated then from, or was taken up by Hengstenberg, and you still can get that. And I have this actually here, and I use this a lot, especially in potato salad. But that has 10% distilled vinegar in it, so it is stretched. And so that is a big difference, is if you want to get this as authentic as possible to what he used back then, to get a better understanding, you probably want to try to find a vinegar which doesn't have any distilled vinegar added in it. And the Bordeaux vinegar I found, and the tarragon vinegar I found, does not have distilled vinegar in it. So they're more expensive, but they're also free of distilled vinegar. We will get more, and they're like in the $15 to $20 range. So they're not the super expensive ones, but they're not the cheap ones either for $5 for 0.75 liters, or half a liter in that range. That is important. The same as the oil. There's really not much to be said. Is primarily that he preferred the Provençal oil, the Herbe de Provence oil, and then when it came to regular oil, which they would make in and around Berlin at the local oil mills, that was rapeseed oil, linseed oil, and sunflower oil. Those were the standard oils they had. For cooking purposes, like in a frying pan, they use primarily lard. And it is interesting, on some of it he uses pork lard, beef, or mutton, from a wide variety of different animals. So they were using the different lard as a fat or as a grease, and then they added the butter. And now we're at the milk section. In 1838, the milk distribution in Berlin was such that they had basically farmers within the city. So they had them on the ground floor. There was a farmer. They had 1, 2, 3 milk cows, and they would produce so and so much milk. So you would go basically to your neighbor. They had one right next to the castle there, to the Prinz Albrecht Palais on Wilhelmstrasse. There were 1 or 2, and they would go over there in the morning, and they would pick up 1 liter, 2 liters, whatever they needed in terms of fresh milk. And that fresh milk had been skimmed off, and that farmer made basically butter and cream and that sort of stuff out of this, whatever he skimmed off. So this milk was fresh. It was hand skimmed, or with a centrifugal skimmed, being separated the fat out of it for cream, the cream part out of it. And that would leave you with probably 2.5% to 3% fresh milk, non-pasteurized, non-homogenized. And that milk tastes very different. Now, I grew up in a rural area, and a friend of mine had a farm, and they had 30 milk cows. So I have milk cows, and I have drank fresh milk at full 5%, the way it comes out of the You do. And at the temperature, and it is very, very different. Normally what they do is that they skim it in a centrifugal. They bring it down to 3% or 2.5%, and then they pasteurize it. That means they're heating it up to about 75, 85 degrees Celsius for a few seconds, and then it is immediately cooled down. As soon as it's gone through that process, the milk tastes different than just a minute or 2 minutes earlier when it was real fresh milk. The whole taste changes. That I know from experience. I can tell you that. And it changes even more as more cream or fat percentage you take out of it for further processing. That means is less fat content. Say like you wind up with 1% milk. That tastes already very different after the centrifugal process to separate the cream out of it. And then that will then yield a different pasteurized milk. And if you're going to take that pasteurized milk and you heat it up again to about 150, 160 degrees Celsius to homogenize this whole thing, or high heat, what the H stands for long, storage purposes, then it becomes a completely different story altogether. So when he refers to fresh milk, to milk, when they're using milk, they're talking about 3% milk, which had only been skimmed but never pasteurized for any cooking process, cooking purposes here, or for drinking, for instance. That was a completely different ballgame. That milk will not last, even when you stand it cold, for more than a day before it's starting to turn sour on you, because the bacteria, or not the bacteria, but the microorganisms, since they haven't been killed, are starting to work in there. And the entire process starts of turning the milk actually sour. That's basically what that is called. So you have to drink that milk fairly quickly or process it very quickly. And that would be then true with all your mayonnaise and everything else what you process out of this. So a mayonnaise, for instance, which is based in part on a fat, milk-derived fat, will be easier storable for 1 or 2 days if it is from pasteurized milk than it is from fresh milk. As soon as you got fresh milk in it, you're going to have one of the best mayonnaise you can ever have. But it will also, with the eggs, of course, the egg with milk or the egg products, whatever you combine and however you combine it, whether you use creme fraiche, which is a sour cream, a higher content sour cream than what we have. The French have the creme fraiche, which is a little bit richer. It's in essence a sour cream, but it's the same story. So if you use that as a base and something as a sauce, and that is fresh, made from fresh milk without being pasteurized first, that will shorten the span of processing and eating considerably. That is one of the things we have to know. So when they cooked something and there was milk involved, that would have tasted different. The same with butter. But other than that is if they're using, for instance, goose fat or pork fat, not just lard, but the actual fat, that is pretty much still the same, especially goose fat is going to be very much the same as it was back then, because the geese just haven't changed that much. If you get the Polish white geese, what we call them, that was the most common one. They're the ones with the orange nose, snout on it. You go, quack, quack, quack. Yeah, those are the ones. They're pretty much the same, and they haven't really changed them that much. Anyway, but this is all the stuff we have to take a look at. So I that's why that took so long. For one, I had to study this book. I had to familiarize myself with these 16 different courses and what he actually meant by this. And that goes back again with the serving size. I think I should, I did not fully explain this in the beginning, but basically these courses, and I'm going to conclude the video with this because you're probably going to be tired by now listening to me for so long. These 16 courses can be then combined, so you can make a a dinner with 3 actual courses. So you would pick your entrees or your meats, big meats, small meats. And of course, on top of this, he also has buffets, actual self-serve buffets in here too. All of this can be arranged in buffets, cold buffets and hot buffet, for larger functions as well. You can scale this in any direction you want. But you basically put that together, so you could have a soup, an hors d'oeuvre, and say like a fish, if you do it in smaller portion, and a meat dish, and then do the pastry and ice cream, for instance, with the alcoholized fruits. I don't know what you would call it other way. That sort of stuff. Or you can just do a soup and an entree, with a vegetable and a cut potato, and you can just serve an ice cream or pastry. It's up to you. So you can vary the portions then individually. Small courses you make, is smaller you make them. And if you want to, as less courses you have, as more food you have. You could leave the soup out and just do an hors d'oeuvre, for instance, and do an entree. Cold entree, warm entree, or then a pastry. There's several different options in this. There's so much in this book here that we probably will wind up over 1,000 videos if we're really gonna go through and do every one of them. There's no question about it. I think what I'm going to do is, like I said, the next video is going to be, when I get to it, we will look at the different vinegars and oils, all of the array what he basically used. In terms of vegetables, basically anything that you have today at a store or in your vegetable garden. Shallots, white onions, sweet onions, red onions, parsley, estragon, all of the stuff is still the same. The parsley, basil, all of these things is exactly the same thing as what dill. All of this is pretty much the same. So, and like I said, there's a lot of these dishes are going to be very familiar to you. You have eaten them, you have seen them, they're nothing new, but they're just slightly prepared differently. Open fire roasting, that was because they said the kitchen was in the basement and they had a big fireplace. The fireplace was big enough to put a spit roast on there, so you could actually roast an entire pig on the spit in your basement. And then with the industrialization came the larger stoves, the iron stoves, and then the baking started in those where you had 1 or 2 compartments. He also wrote in here, just for your info, the common firing material he used, heat source, was coal. So he had gone already away by 1838 from wood to actually coal firing the stove, except for the fireplace where they actually would use wood. And the fireplace, really, with the roast on it, would be your traditional barbecue grill, in essence. So they had everything indoor, and they could vary this. So this is why he describes all these different baking, for instance, or boiling, and roasting on an open fire, and all of the stuff is explained, and how this is done. And the combination of this. So you could have it's one of the most amazing and interesting books I've ever come across. And it's sure, if we're thinking that we're living in great times, looking at the variety of food described in here, in dishes, I think our kitchens today look very, very small. That's the food for thought. With that, we will see you the next time with ingredients and stuff like this. and we will get our hands dirty, so to speak. With that, you have a great night. Thank you.